Snow was falling from the gray sky, covering the streets of the alien city in a cold white blanket. The wind moved like sharp knives between the buildings, cutting into skin. Voices from the market mixed together, shouting, arguing, laughing. But none of them spoke to the thin figure standing at the corner. She was small, her body weak, her skin pale under the dirt. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face. She had nothing on but torn rags. Barely enough to cover her. Her bare feet stood on the frozen ground, the toes turning blue from the cold. Every time the wind came, she shivered like a leaf, but she did not move. People passed her without slowing. Some turned their heads away, others laughed. A group of children threw small pieces of rotten food at her feet. She did not bend to pick them up. It was as if she had stopped expecting kindness from anyone. Her head stayed low, her eyes half closed, to most. She looked like she was already fading away. Daniel, a human trader, was walking through the market. Looking for spare engine parts, he had been on this planet for only 2 days. But he already hated it. The city smelled of smoke and oil. And greed seemed to be in the air like dust. Still, nothing had made him stop in his tracks until now. His eyes had fallen on the girl in the corner. She raised her head for a brief moment, and their eyes met. Her eyes were large and dark, but what Daniel saw inside them made his chest tighten. It was not just sadness, it was a deep emptiness. The kind a person carried only when they had lost everything. Daniel froze for a second, then walked toward a nearby vendor. "Who is she?" he asked. The vendor, an alien with scales along his jaw, smirked. "Property," he said, nodding toward the girl. "Belonged to a mining crew. Ran away, got caught. No one wants her, not worth the feed." Daniel frowned. "She's a person, not a thing." The vendor shrugged. "Everything is a thing if someone can sell it." Daniel looked back at the girl. She had lowered her head again. But now her shoulders shook slightly under the cold. He took off his thick brown coat and stepped toward her. "Here," he said softly, holding it out. For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes fixed on the coat as if she didn't understand. Slowly, her thin hands reached out, touching the fabric. It was warm. She wrapped it around herself, pulling it tight. The trembling in her body began to slow. Behind him, the vendor's voice cut through the air. "If you want her, you pay." Daniel turned. "I'm not buying her," the vendor laughed, his teeth yellow. "Then you leave her here, or she freezes. Human, those are the rules." The market noise seemed to fade as more people stopped to watch. Eyes turned toward them, curious to see what the human would do. Daniel looked back at the girl. She was holding the coat like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Her lips moved, and he leaned closer to hear. "What's your name?" he asked. Her voice was small, almost a whisper. "Lyra." The vendor stepped closer, folding his arms. "So, human, are you keeping her, or walking away?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He hadn't planned on this, but he knew one thing. If he left her here, she would not see another sunrise. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small pouch of credits. "This is all I have," he said. The vendor opened it, counting quickly. "Not enough," he said. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low. "It's enough for a life." The vendor's smirk faded into a long stare. Finally, he snatched the pouch. "Fine, take her. But don't bring her back when she dies." Daniel put his arm lightly around Lyra's shoulders, guiding her away from the corner. She moved slowly, each step careful. The snow crunched under their feet. Behind them, the crowd began to disperse, voices fading back into the noise of the market. They walked through narrow streets toward the docking port. The air grew colder, but the coat and Daniel's presence kept her from shaking too much. Every now and then, she glanced at him, as if checking to see if he was real. Daniel didn't speak. He knew words could wait. What she needed right now was warmth, safety, and time. When the lights of his small ship came into view, something In her eyes changed. It was not a smile, but it was the faintest flicker of life. For the first time in years, Lyra was walking towards something that might keep her alive. And Daniel, without fully understanding why, felt certain that saving her was the most important thing he had done in a long time. The streets outside the market were quieter, but the cold bit even harder here. Lyra walked beside Daniel, still wrapped in his coat. The fabric too big for her small frame, her hands clutched it tightly. As if afraid someone might rip it away, Daniel glanced at her once, noting the way she kept her head down and her steps small. He could tell she was used to following rather than leading. They moved through narrow alleys lined with rusted metal. Walls' faint steam rose from grates in the ground, the only warmth in the frozen air. The shadows here were long and deep, and every corner felt like it could hide danger. Daniel kept his pace steady, scanning each intersection. He didn't want trouble, but in this city, trouble often came looking for you. When the faint glow of the docking port lights appeared ahead, Lyra slowed. Her eyes shifted to movement on the left. 3 figures stepping out from between the buildings. Daniel's hand instinctively moved toward his blaster. The man in front was the vendor from the market, his scaly grin stretched wide. "Human," the vendor called. "We need to talk." Daniel stopped but didn't step closer. "We already talked," he said flatly. The vendor shook his head slowly. "You didn't pay enough. That was all I had, and you agreed." Daniel replied. The vendor shrugged. "I changed my mind. She's worth more now that someone wants her." Behind him, the 2 others shifted, their hands near their weapons. Lyra pressed closer to Daniel, her fingers digging into the coat. Daniel's voice dropped to a low warning. "Walk away." The vendor laughed. "Or what? You'll shoot in the street." Daniel's tone stayed cold. "If I have to for a moment." No one moved. The cold wind swirled between them, carrying the faint sound of voices from the distant market. Then the vendor stepped back slightly. "Fine, human," he said, his grin still in place. "But the next time we see you, she's ours again." Daniel didn't answer. He just turned and guided Lyra toward the port. When they reached the Wayfarer, Daniel unlocked the ramp and motioned her inside. She stopped at the threshold, her eyes wide as she looked at the small but clean interior. Warm air drifted toward her from the heater inside. She stepped in slowly, her bare feet feeling the smooth floor under them. Daniel closed the ramp and secured the lock. "Sit there," he said, pointing to a bench near the heater. She obeyed, still gripping the coat, her eyes moving nervously around the cabin. Daniel stepped into the small kitchen space, pulling out a thermal blanket and draping it over her shoulders. Then he poured hot water into a metal cup and handed it to her. She stared at it for a moment before sipping carefully, the steam fogging her face. "You paid for me?" she asked quietly. Daniel sat across from her, leaning forward. "I didn't buy you," he said. "I paid to make sure you could leave with me." Her brows drew together slightly. "Why?" Daniel paused, then said simply, "Because you deserve to live." She looked down at the cup, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said I wasn't worth anything." Daniel's eyes stayed on her, his voice firm. "They were wrong." She glanced up at him quickly, as if checking if he truly meant it. Something in her gaze softened, but she said nothing more. The heater hummed softly, filling the silence between them. Daniel stood and began preparing food. He opened a pack of bread and a container of stew, the scent quickly filling the cabin. Lyra's eyes followed his movements, though she tried to hide it when he placed the bowl in front of her. She hesitated. "Go ahead," he said. "It's yours." She took a small bite, then another. Soon she was eating faster, her hands trembling slightly. Daniel let her finish without speaking, knowing she needed the food more than anything else right now. When the bowl was empty, she set it down slowly, her eyes lowering again. "Thank you," she murmured. "You don't need to thank me," Daniel replied. "Just focus on getting your strength back." Outside, the snow continued to fall, the port lights casting long shadows across the frozen ground. Daniel glanced toward the window, his mind already working through the next steps. The vendor's words still echoed in his ears. They weren't done with him yet, and that meant time was against them. He turned back to Lyra. "We'll be leaving soon," he said. Her eyes widened slightly. "Leaving the city." "Leaving the planet," Daniel corrected. "Somewhere far, somewhere safe." She didn't reply, but for a moment he saw a flicker of something in her face, a mixture of fear and hope. The hum of the Wayfarer's engines was faint. Like a soft heartbeat in the quiet cabin, Lyra sat on the bench near the heater. The thermal blanket wrapped tightly around her small frame. The warmth felt strange to her, almost like it did not belong. For so long she had known only the cold, cold stone floors. Cold nights, cold stairs. Now heat was soaking into her skin, and part of her didn't trust it to last. Daniel moved in the small kitchen area, his steps steady, his hands working without rush. He opened a container of thick stew, the scent rising slowly into the air. The smell was rich: meat, root vegetables, and warm spices. Lyra's stomach twisted with hunger, but she stayed still. Years of surviving in the mines and streets had taught her never to ask for food. If you asked, someone could take it away. Before you got a bite, Daniel glanced over his shoulder at her. "You like stew?" he asked, his tone casual. Lyra hesitated, then gave a small nod. A faint smile touched his lips. "Good, this one's fresh, not the dried stuff." He stirred the pot slowly, letting the scent grow stronger until it filled every corner of the cabin. Memories she had buried began to surface: a bowl of soup her mother had once given her when she was very small. It had been warm, filling, and safe. She could still remember her mother's hand resting on her head. That memory had faded over the years, worn down by hunger and cold. Now, the smell in the air pulled it painfully close again. Daniel set a steaming bowl in front of her. "Go on," he said gently. "It's yours." Lyra stared at the stew as if it were something unreal. Her fingers brushed the side of the bowl. Feeling its heat, she took a slow first spoonful, the taste flooding her mouth with warmth. She swallowed quickly, then took another, bigger bite. Within minutes, her spoon was moving faster. The sound of her eating was the only thing in the room. Daniel didn't speak. He leaned back in his chair, watching her without judgment. He knew enough to understand that for her, this was not just a meal. It was proof that someone cared. When the bowl was empty, she set the spoon down carefully, as if afraid to make noise. Her hands stayed wrapped around the bowl for a few seconds more, holding on to its fading warmth. "Do you want more?" Daniel asked. She shook her head, her voice low. "No. I'm full." He nodded and took the bowl away. She followed him with her eyes, still half expecting him to demand something in return. He returned to the table and sat across from her. "So," he said, "Lyra, how long has it been since you had a real meal?" She kept her gaze on the blanket. "I don't remember," she whispered. Her voice was flat, without emotion, the way someone spoke when pain had been part of them for too long. Daniel didn't press. Instead, he said quietly, "You don't have to worry now. There will always be food here." Her eyes lifted slightly at his words, but doubt lingered there. She had been promised safety before, and it had always been taken away. Trust was not something she could give so easily. The heater hummed, filling the silence. Outside, the snow still fell, the lights of the port casting a soft glow into the darkness. Daniel checked the ship's systems, making sure everything was ready for departure. When he looked back, Lyra was still watching him from under the blanket. Her expression was cautious, but not as guarded as before. "You should rest," he said. Pointing to the bench, her fingers gripped the blanket tighter. "Here." "Yes," Daniel replied. "It's warm, and you'll be safe." She looked at the bench, then at him, searching his face for a trap. Finally, she nodded and lay down slowly, keeping the blanket wrapped around her. Daniel dimmed the lights, but stayed at the controls. He knew the vendor's warning wasn't just words. Men like that didn't let things go. The ship would need to leave soon, before anyone could organize a proper hunt. But for now, he stayed awake, letting Lyra sleep in peace for the first time in years. She drifted off within minutes, her breathing soft and even. Daniel glanced at her once, the faint rise and fall of her chest reminding him of how fragile life could be. He didn't know why he had stepped in to save her, but as the snowstorm raged outside, he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let her go back to that life. The next morning, pale light filtered through the small window of the Wayfarer. The storm outside had slowed, but the air still carried a sharp coldness that bit through metal. Daniel sat at the table, sipping a mug of hot tea, his eyes watching the heater's soft glow. Lyra sat across from him, her blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Her hands cupped a warm mug he had given her, the steam rising to touch her face. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound came from the faint hum of the engines and the occasional groan of the docking ports' metal supports shifting in the cold. Daniel knew she was awake in more ways than one, not just from sleep, but from the safety she had felt last night. Still, there was a wall in her eyes, a quiet distance that had not yet broken. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but direct. "Lyra," he said, "if I'm going to keep you safe, I need to know what we're running from." Her gaze lowered to the mug in her hands. Her fingers tightened slightly, as if the question had weight. He didn't press her, letting the silence stretch. Finally, her voice came low, careful, like she was pulling each word from a locked place inside her. "I was born in the mines," she said. Her eyes stayed on the table, not meeting his. "My people. We were taken there when I was just a baby. They said it was a debt, but no one ever left." She paused, the steam from the tea curling around her face. "My parents. They died when I was little. I don't even remember their faces clearly. Just their voices." Daniel didn't move, didn't interrupt. She took a breath before continuing. "I grew up carrying tools, cleaning the tunnels, bringing water to the workers." Her voice became flat, without feeling. "If you got sick, they threw you out into the snow. If you slowed down, they beat you." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had heard of such places, but hearing it from her, seeing the way she spoke as if it were normal, made something cold burn in his chest. "How did you get out?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then said, "One night. The guard for my section was drunk. I ran. I thought I could find work in the city, but I had nothing, not even clothes. So they caught me, called me a thief, sold me to the market." Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of someone who had told the story too many times in her own head. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the table. "They said you weren't worth anything," he said, "but they were wrong." She glanced at him quickly, as if trying to decide if he meant it. Something in her shoulders shifted, a tiny lessening of the tension she always carried. "They'll come for me," she said suddenly. Her voice was sharper now, laced with fear. "They always come back. For what they think is theirs." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then we'll make sure they can't find you," he said. She shook her head. "They always find people, no matter how far they run." "Not if I'm with you," Daniel replied, his tone steady. For a long time, neither of them spoke again. Lyra sipped her tea, her eyes still shadowed by doubt. Daniel stood and began moving around the cabin, checking the ship's systems. The hum of the console filled the air as he reviewed the fuel reserves and navigation charts. When he looked back, she was still sitting quietly, but her gaze was fixed on him in a way that was different, not just watching, but trying to understand. him. By midday, Daniel had decided, "We leave tonight," he said. Her head lifted slightly. "Why not now?" "Because they'll be watching," he explained. "If we wait until the port quiets down, we can slip away without drawing attention." She nodded slowly, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. That evening, Daniel cooked another simple meal. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the heavy silence of before. It was calmer. Afterward, he handed her a small datapad, showing her the route they'd take. "This will get us out of their reach," he said. Her eyes traced the glowing lines on the screen. Though she likely didn't understand all of it, still, she nodded. "It looks far." "It is," Daniel replied, "and that's good." When it was time for her to rest, she curled up on the bench again. Blanket tucked around her, Daniel dimmed the lights, but stayed at the controls outside. The cold wind swept across the docks, carrying faint echoes from the city. He knew the slavers might already be planning their next move, but he also knew something else this time. They wouldn't be chasing a helpless girl this time. They'd be chasing her and the man who refused to let her go. Night had fallen over the city of Crave, the snow falling heavier now. The docking port was quieter than usual, most ships locked down against the cold. The Wayfarer sat in the far corner of the landing bay, its lights dimmed, its engines silent. Daniel kept the cabin dark, only the faint glow of the heater lighting the space. Lyra sat on the bench, wrapped in her blanket, her eyes drifting to the small window. She watched the snow swirl in the shadows outside. Part of her wanted to believe they were safe here until they left. But deep down, she knew safety was never permanent. Daniel sat at the controls, checking systems quietly. His eyes scanned the radar, his ears tuned to the smallest sound. Then it came, the muffled thud of footsteps on the metal platform outside. Slow, heavy, deliberate, Daniel froze for a moment, then reached for the blaster at his side. The steps stopped just outside the main door. A voice followed, low but sharp. "Human, open up. We just want to talk." Lyra's eyes went wide, her grip on the blanket tightening. She knew that voice. It belonged to one of the vendor's men from the market. Daniel moved to the door controls but didn't open it. "What do you want?" he asked through the intercom. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." The man replied, "Hand over the girl and we'll let you go." Daniel's jaw tightened. "She's not yours," he said. "And she's not going anywhere." There was a pause, then a laugh. "You think you can keep her? You have no idea how many people want her back." Daniel kept his voice cold. "If you want her, you'll have to get past me." The sound of shifting feet told him more men had joined outside. Lyra slid off the bench and crouched behind the table, her breathing quick and shallow. Her heart pounded in her ears as she listened to the voices outside. The pounding on the door began, loud and steady. "You can't hide forever, human." The voice shouted. "We'll take her and your ship too." Daniel stood beside the door, weapon ready. His mind raced. If they forced their way in, the fight could turn ugly fast. He pressed the intercom again. "You have one chance to leave," he said. "If you stay, you won't walk away." There was a tense silence, broken only by the wind outside. Then, as quickly as it began, the pounding stopped. He heard footsteps moving away, their echoes fading into the night. Daniel didn't relax. He knew they hadn't given up. They were likely regrouping, maybe even calling for more men. He turned to Lyra, who was still crouched low, her eyes wide. "They're gone for now," he said. She shook her head quickly. "They'll come back." "I know," Daniel replied. "That's why we're leaving now." She blinked in surprise. "Now? You said we'd wait." "That was before they found us," he said, moving toward the controls. In moments, the Wayfarer came alive. The hum of the engines grew. The lights flickered on. Daniel unlocked the docking clamps and tapped the controls. To open the bay doors outside, the snow blew in thick white sheets. Lyra climbed into the co-pilot's seat, still holding the blanket tight around her. "Will they follow?" she asked quietly. "They can try," Daniel answered. "But they won't catch us." The Wayfarer lifted slowly from the landing pad. The thrusters glowing against the night. The city lights shrank below them, fading into the storm. Daniel guided the ship higher, breaking through the thick clouds into the clear black of space. For a few moments, the stars were all they saw. Then, a red blip appeared on the radar. Daniel cursed under his breath, pushing the throttle forward. A slaver ship was trailing them, moving fast. Lyra's hands gripped the edge of her seat. Her eyes locked on the screen. The Wayfarer dove toward a drifting field of frozen debris. Chunks of rock and ice floated in the void, their surfaces glittering in the starlight. Daniel weaved between them, the slaver ship following, but struggling. To match his turns, an alarm blared. Target lock detected. Daniel banked hard to the left. Breaking the lock just in time, Lyra gasped, but Daniel's hands stayed steady on the controls. A sharp turn brought them behind a massive piece of ice, blocking them from the slaver's view. He cut the engines, letting the Wayfarer drift silently. The radar showed the enemy ship slowing, scanning. Then, slowly, it turned away, disappearing into the darkness. Daniel waited a few more minutes before powering the engines again. "They're gone," he said. Lyra turned to him, her voice soft but certain. "You really won't let them take me?" Daniel looked straight ahead, his voice firm. "Not now, not ever." The Wayfarer glided through the dark, leaving Crail and its frozen skies far behind. The stars stretched endlessly around them, cold and bright. Daniel kept his hands steady on the controls, his eyes scanning the radar for any sign of pursuit. Beside him, Lyra sat wrapped in her blanket, her gaze fixed on the glass window ahead. She had never been this far from a planet before, never seen so much space without walls or chains for the first time in years. She could breathe without tasting dust or smoke. Every deep breath felt strange, like her lungs didn't quite believe they could fill. Daniel glanced at her briefly, noticing the way she leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he asked. She nodded slowly, her voice soft. "It feels free." Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile, but his mind stayed focused. The slavers would not give up easily. Ships like theirs could track a target for days if they had the right coordinates. He needed to vanish from their sensors completely. That meant taking a path most pilots avoided. He tapped a few keys, bringing up the navigation map. "We're heading into the Astera belt," he said. Lyra tilted her head. "Is that safe?" "Not really," Daniel admitted. "Rogue asteroids, magnetic storms, sometimes pirates. But the slavers won't risk following." Her hands tightened slightly on the blanket, but she gave a small nod, trusting him. Hours passed as the Wayfarer moved toward the faint shimmer ahead. The Astera belt came into view, a twisting field of rock and ice drifting in endless slow motion. Some chunks were small as crates, others large enough to cast shadows like mountains. The belt was alive with movement, each piece spinning in its own path. Daniel lowered the ship's speed, weaving carefully between the drifting shapes. The hull rang softly as tiny fragments of ice struck the metal. Lyra kept her eyes on the shifting maze around them. "Do you do this a lot?" she asked quietly. Daniel gave a small chuckle. "Not when I can avoid it." A faint tremor in the ship's frame told him a magnetic storm was near. Suddenly, the radar beeped, an incoming signal closing fast. Daniel's expression hardened. "Is it them?" Lyra asked quickly. "No," Daniel said. "It's worse, pirates." A sleek black ship appeared in the distance, cutting through the rocks with frightening speed. "They'll try to board us," Daniel said, "but we won't let them." He pushed the throttle forward, the Wayfarer weaving between the asteroids. The pirate ship followed closely, its weapons lighting the darkness with brief flashes. Chunks of rock exploded into dust as shots missed by meters. Lyra gasped but stayed in her seat, gripping the armrest tightly. Daniel spotted a narrow gap ahead, barely wide enough for the Wayfarer to fit. He angled the ship toward it without hesitation. "Hold on," he warned. The Wayfarer shot through, the asteroid walls passing so close that the ship's wings almost scraped them. The pirate ship tried to follow, but one of its engines clipped the rock, sending it spinning sideways. Daniel didn't wait to see the damage. He darted deeper into the belt, using the dense field to mask their escape. The radar showed the pirate's signal fading. Lyra let out a shaky breath. You saved us again." Daniel glanced at her. "That's the idea." They drifted in the shadow of a massive asteroid for nearly an hour. The magnetic interference here would scramble any tracking scans when Daniel finally powered the engines. Again, the space around them was clear. The stars beyond the belt looked sharper, brighter, like a different part of the galaxy entirely. He set a course for Haven Reach, a human colony several systems away. As the ship settled into its new route, Lyra kept watching the stars. Her voice was quiet, but certain. "I don't think I've ever been this far from fear before." Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Get used to it." He said, "You're free now." She turned her gaze back to the window, her lips curving into the smallest of smiles, for the first time since she could remember. She let herself believe he might be right. The Wayfarer dropped out of hyperspace, revealing the bright blue and green world of Haven Reach ahead. The twin suns bathed the planet in golden light, making the oceans sparkle and the forests glow. From the cockpit, Lyra pressed closer too. The glass, her eyes wide with wonder. She had never seen a place that looked so alive. No smoke, no poison skies, no endless snow, just warmth and color. Daniel slowed the ship as the docking beacons guided them toward the colony. "This place is different," he said. "It's safe, and the people here look after each other." Lyra didn't answer right away, her gaze still locked on the world below. Finally, she whispered, "It doesn't look like it wants to hurt me." Daniel gave a faint smile. "That's because it doesn't." They landed at a small docking port on the colony's edge. When the ramp lowered, a wave of warm, fresh air rolled inside. Lyra stepped slowly to the edge, pausing at the top of the ramp. The ground beneath her bare feet felt strange, soft soil instead of cold stone or metal. She took one cautious step, then another. Daniel led her through the port toward the market square. The air was filled with the scent of fresh bread, roasted meat, and flowers. Vendors called out in friendly tones, not shouting in anger or mocking. Voices, children ran past them, laughing freely. Lyra turned her head in every direction, trying to take in every sound, every color. They stopped at a clothing stall where the vendor, a kind-eyed woman, looked Lyra up and down. Without a word, the woman began gathering clothes from her shelves: soft shirts, sturdy pants, a thick jacket, and clean boots. Lyra hesitated, glancing at Daniel. "They're for you," he said, his tone gentle. Her fingers brushed the fabric, feeling the warmth in each piece. It had been years since she had owned anything that truly belonged to her. When she changed into the clothes, the difference was clear. She still carried the thin frame of someone who had gone hungry for too long. But now she stood straighter, her eyes meeting Daniel's more directly. Next, they went to an inn near the market. Daniel arranged for a small, private room for her when they stepped inside. Lyra stood frozen in the doorway. The room had a bed, with clean sheets, a small wooden table, and a window looking out at the hills. "This is mine," she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "All yours?" She walked slowly to the bed. Pressing her hands against the blanket, her eyes traced every detail as if committing it to memory. Finally, she turned back to him, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Daniel said. Just live, that evening. They sat in the inn's dining hall, sharing a warm meal. The fire crackled in the hearth. Casting a golden light across the room, Lyra ate slowly, savoring each bite. She no longer rushed like she might lose the food. For the first time, she felt safe enough to take her time when the plates were cleared. Daniel walked her back to the room. He stood at the door, his expression calm but certain. I have work to do, he said, but I'll be back, and if you ever need me, you send word. She stared at him for a long moment. You're leaving, she said quietly, not accusing, just understanding. I am, he replied. But you're not alone anymore. Lyra stepped forward and hugged him. It was a hesitant hug at first, but it grew tighter. You gave me more than clothes, she whispered. You gave me hope. Daniel rested a hand on her back. And you gave me a reason to fight, he said, when he stepped outside into the night air. The twin moons hung above the hills. The streets were calm, the scent of flowers drifting on the wind. Daniel knew there would always be cruelty somewhere in the galaxy. But here, at least for now, one life was safe, and that was enough inside. Lyra stood by the window, looking up at the stars. She knew danger still existed somewhere out there. But for the first time, it wasn't pressing in on her. Here, she had a bed, warm clothes, food, and most importantly, the belief that her life had value. Her lips curved into a small smile as she whispered to herself, "This is the beginning."